The woman who stepped off the noon stage in Redrock Flats on a Tuesday in April of 1878 wore black from the crown of her hat to the hem of her skirt, and every soul on that main street stopped what they were doing just to watch her arrive. It was not merely the mourning clothes that arrested them, though the sight of a woman dressed in full widow's weeds stepping into the dust and heat of a West Texas cattle town was unusual enough to give any man pause. It was the way she carried herself, spine straight as a fence post, chin lifted just enough to suggest she was not looking down at the world, but rather measuring it carefully before deciding what to do with it. She had a single travel trunk that the driver heaved down from the top of the coach, and she thanked him with a quiet word and a nod that somehow managed to be both dignified and final, the way a woman thanks someone when she has grown accustomed to doing everything alone. The stage driver climbed back up to his seat, hollered at his team, and was gone in a cloud of copper-colored dust, leaving the woman standing in the middle of the street with her trunk at her feet, and a name nobody in that town had ever heard on the lips of Hattie Greer, who ran the general store and who had already come out to her porch to get a better look. "You must be the one who sent that telegraph," Hattie called out, squinting against the afternoon glare. "Said your name was Lucinda Voss." The woman turned her head slowly toward Hattie. "That's right," she said. Her voice was clear and even, the kind of voice that did not waver, and yet something in it made Hattie frown. She had been reading people coming through Redrock Flats for 22 years, and she knew the difference between a voice that told you the truth and a voice that told you something adjacent to it. "Well, Miss Voss," Hattie said, coming down off the porch and wiping her hands on her apron, "you said in the telegraph you were looking for work. You don't get many women coming here alone." "I am aware of that," the woman said. Hattie reached her and put out a hand. "Hattie Greer, I keep the store and I know near about everything that happens in this town, so if there's anything you need to know, you come to me first." The woman shook her hand once firmly. "Thank you, Mrs. Greer." "Miss," Hattie corrected pleasantly. "Never found the right man, or rather the right men never found the sense to ask." She looked the woman up and down without apology. "You are in mourning." "Yes." "Recent?" The woman's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Recent enough." Hattie decided not to press further, at least not in the street. "Come on inside. It's hot enough to cook a lizard out here, and I expect you have not eaten since whatever town you came from. I'll get you something, and we can talk about what kind of work you're looking for." It was in this manner that the woman who called herself Lucinda Voss entered Redrock Flats, and it was in this manner that Calvin Rhodes first saw her. Calvin had been standing at the far end of the hardware store's hitching post, checking the shoes on his roan gelding, Buck, when the stage came in. He had watched the woman the same as everyone else, but where the others had lost interest after the first minute or so and returned to their business, Calvin had kept watching. He was 29 years old, 6 feet tall with wide shoulders that came honestly from years of ranching, and he had a face that the sun had marked thoroughly, not unpleasantly, just honestly. He had brown eyes the color of creek water in autumn, and he had a way of going very still when he was thinking that some people mistook for slowness and some people, the wiser ones, recognized as the opposite. He watched the woman in black carry herself across that street, like she was walking through a battlefield she had already survived, and something in the back of his chest did a slow, deliberate turn that he did not quite know what to do with. He finished checking Buck's left rear shoe, which was fine and had always been fine, and he straightened up and looked at the closed door of Hattie's store for a moment. Then he put his hat back on, took the reins, and walked his horse to the water trough. He had a delivery of fencing wire to pick up and a 3-hour ride back to his ranch, the Double R, which he ran alone since his foreman, Pete Aldridge, had left for New Mexico in February on account of a woman Pete had met at Christmas. Calvin did not begrudge Pete the woman. He just missed having someone reliable to talk to at dinner. He picked up his fencing wire, loaded it onto the pack horse, and was tying off the second load when he heard raised voices from the direction of the Dusty Boot Saloon, which was directly across the street from him. The voices belonged to two men Calvin knew. Chester Prout, a broad, red-faced man of about 40 who ran cattle on the South Range and who had a reputation for getting mean when he drank, and a younger man named Wally Prout, Chester's nephew, who did everything his uncle did, only louder and with less intelligence behind it. Chester and Wally were not arguing with each other. They were both aimed at a third person, and when Calvin turned to look, he realized the third person was the woman in black, who had apparently come back out of Hattie's store and was standing on the boardwalk with a wrapped parcel under her arm, looking at the Prout men with the same measuring, unrattled expression she had given the entire town when she stepped off the stage. "I asked you a question, Missy," Chester was saying. His voice had the particular slur of a man who had been drinking since mid-morning. "Where'd you come from?" "I came from the stage," the woman said, "same as anyone would. That ain't what I'm asking, and you know it." "I'm afraid I cannot help you, sir, if you will not ask what you mean to ask." Chester stepped up onto the boardwalk, and Calvin saw his hand come up, not to strike, not quite, but hovering in that territory between threat and action that was dangerous in its own right. "You think you're real smart, don't you? A woman like you rolling into a town like this wearing all that black, no husband, no family." "Chester." Calvin's voice came across the street flat and quiet, but it carried. Everything he said carried, which was something people learned about him early. "That is enough." Chester turned. His face went through several calculations. Calvin Rhodes was not a man anyone in Redrock Flats wanted to start a problem with, not because he was hot-tempered. He was nearly the opposite, but because there was a quality to him in moments like this one that made even drunk men reconsider their choices. He was a respected rancher. He was steady, and when he decided something was wrong, he had a habit of making it right that could not be easily argued with. Wally looked between his uncle and Calvin and said nothing, which showed more wisdom than he usually displayed. Chester lowered his hand. He muttered something into his collar, stepped off the boardwalk, and walked back into the dusty boot with Wally following like a shadow. Calvin crossed the street. The woman in black was watching him approach with those same calm, measuring eyes, dark brown. He could see now, dark enough to be almost black in this light, with something behind them that was not quite grief and not quite hardness, but was some combination of the two that he imagined took considerable experience to achieve. He touched the brim of his hat. "Calvin Rhodes," he said. "I ranch up on the North Range. I apologize for Chester Prout. He is unpleasant on his good days, and today is not one of them." "You do not need to apologize for another man's behavior," she said, "but thank you. Where are you headed with that parcel?" She looked down at it as if she had briefly forgotten she was holding it. "I'm not entirely sure yet. Mrs. Greer was kind enough to give me supplies, but I have not found a place to stay." "Doc Henshaw rents the upstairs room above his office," Calvin said. "He is a decent man. His wife Clara is even better. She would not let anyone bother you." He paused. "If you do not mind me saying so." She looked at him for a moment that lasted one beat longer than conversation required. "I do not mind," she said. He walked with her to Doc Henshaw's, which took 3 minutes, and he did not ask her any questions on the way, which she noticed. Most people, in his experience, pelted strangers with questions like they were throwing rocks, trying to break through the surface and see what was underneath. Calvin had found that if you simply walked alongside someone and let the silence be easy rather than demanding, people often told you more than they would have if you'd asked. She did not tell him anything on that short walk, but she thanked him at the door of the doctor's office with a warmth in her voice that had not been there before, and he thought about that warmth on the long ride back to his ranch. He thought about it more than he expected to. Doc Henshaw, a lean, spectacled man of about 50, was more than willing to rent the upstairs room. His wife Clara, who was 47 and had red hair going silver and a laugh that rattled the windows, took one look at the woman in black and immediately made her a cup of coffee and a plate of cornbread, and sat with her at the kitchen table for an hour while Doc saw to a patient in the front room. "You do not have to tell me anything," Clara said. in the way that made it clear she was hoping to hear everything. The woman held her coffee cup in both hands and looked at the steam rising from it. "My name is Lucinda Voss," she said. Clara nodded in a way that said she was filing that information away in a specific drawer labeled things that may not be entirely true. "And you are in mourning. My husband passed 3 months ago. I am sorry for your loss." Clara meant it, but she also read the woman's face carefully when she said it, and what she saw there was complicated. Was it sudden? Yes. The word came out the same as the previous ones, flat and even, but something beneath it shifted, like a fish moving just below the surface of still water. Very sudden. Clara poured more coffee without asking. "Well, you are welcome here as long as you need a roof. Doc and I will not pry." She paused and then added, with the particular honesty of a woman who has seen enough of life to be done pretending, "But if you find yourself wanting to talk, I am a very good listener. And I am absolutely terrible at gossip, which is a rare quality in a small town, and I am rather proud of it." The woman called Lucinda Voss smiled then. It was a small smile, just a brief movement at the corner of her mouth, but it changed her face entirely. Underneath all that careful composure, underneath the mourning clothes and the measured voice and the eyes that had seen too much too recently, there was someone younger, someone who had once smiled easily and often, and who was only now remembering that she still could. "Thank you," she said, and this time she meant it all the way through. Calvin came back to town 3 days later on a Thursday for supplies he genuinely needed, and he told himself that was the only reason he came, which was partly true. He picked up coffee and flour and a box of cartridges at Hattie's store, and he was tying off his pack when he saw the woman in black walking across the street toward the school. She was carrying a slate board and a box of chalk, and she had her hair pinned up differently than the first day, more practically, less formally. And the morning clothes were the same but cleaner, pressed, with the collar turned in a way that made her look less like she was attending a funeral and more like she was simply a woman who happened to be wearing black on a fine spring morning. He caught up with her easily on account of his stride, which was long. "You found work at the school." She looked sideways at him without surprise, as if she had heard him coming. "Mrs. Greer knows the school board chairman, Mr. Porter. He said their last teacher left in February and he is desperate enough to give the position to anyone with a proper education." She paused. "I have a proper education." "What kind?" "The reading and writing and arithmetic kind," she said, with a dry precision that was the closest thing to humor he had heard from her. "Also French literature, which I expect will be less immediately useful." "Probably," he agreed. He fell into step beside her and she did not slow down or speed up, which he took as an invitation. "You settling in all right? Doc Henshaw treating you decently? He and Clara have been very kind." She shifted the slate under her arm. "Your town is smaller than I expected." "Where did you come from?" He asked it the way he asked everything, quietly, without pressure, like a man asking about the weather. Not because he was not curious, but because he had decided that she would answer when she was ready, and asking harder would not make that happen sooner. "East of here," she said, and left it at that. He let it go. "The school has 12 students right now. The oldest is 13, name of Tommy Birch. He is clever, and he will test you in the first 5 minutes to see what you are made of. The youngest is 5, little Margaret Flores, whose mother Alina is one of the finest women in the county and who will bring you tamales every Friday if you are good to her daughter." The woman glanced at him. "You know all the students' families." "I have lived here since I was 19, he said simply. 10 years on the same range, you know people." "That must be," she started and then stopped herself. "Nice," he offered. "I was going to say unusual," she said. "For me." He thought about that. "You have moved around a great deal." "Yes." They reached the school, which was a single-room whitewashed building with 2 windows on each side and a bell above the door that someone had tied a blue ribbon to for reasons that were unclear. She stopped at the door and turned to face him. He was struck again by how difficult she was to read. Most people, the moment they stood still and looked directly at you, gave something away: nervousness, warmth, guardedness, some flicker of what they were feeling. This woman gave away almost nothing, and yet she was not cold. There was warmth in her, he could feel it, the way you can feel the sun on your skin without looking at it directly. It was just very carefully managed. "Thank you again," she said, "for the other day with those men. It was nothing worth thanking me for." "It was something worth thanking you for," she corrected, with a slight but definite firmness that surprised him, "whether you believe that or not." He held her gaze for a moment. "I'll take your word for it then," he said. She almost smiled again. Almost. Then she turned and went into the school. He stood at the bottom of the schoolhouse step for longer than he should have, looking at the closed door, and then he walked back to his horse. That evening, sitting on the porch of his ranch house with a cup of coffee cooling in his hand, and the spring stars coming out one by one over the dark line of the hills, Calvin thought about the woman in black with more deliberateness than he had previously allowed himself. He was a man who lived practically. He had built the Double R from a quarter section of rocky grazing land into a working cattle operation over 10 years of consistent, unglamorous effort. He had been engaged once to a woman named Sarah Coulter, who had decided 8 months before the wedding that she could not live this far from her family in Tennessee and had gone back east. He had grieved that loss genuinely, and then he had worked, which was what he did when he did not know what else to do. He was not a man who went looking for complications, but something about the woman who called herself Lucinda Voss was staying with him in a way he did not entirely know how to categorize, and Calvin Rhodes was a man who liked to know what things were. He thought about the way she had said it was something worth thanking you for, and he thought about the line of her back when she walked, and he thought about that almost smile, and then he finished his coffee and went to bed. On Friday morning he rode to town again with no pretense of supplies to collect. He found Clara Henshaw first, which was intentional. Clara was planting tomatoes in the small garden behind the doctor's office, and she looked up at him with the particular expression of a woman who has known a young man since he was not so young and who finds his current behavior transparently interesting. "You are here again," she said. "I have business at the land office," he said. "The land office is closed on Fridays, Calvin." He was quiet for a moment. "How is she getting on?" Clara sat back on her heels and pulled off one garden glove, which she used to point at him in an accusatory manner. "She is getting on just fine. She was up before dawn this morning, which worried me until I realized she was sitting on the window ledge reading by the early light. She had a book in French, and when I asked her what she was reading, she translated a passage for me that was so beautiful I sat down on the floor." Clara paused. "She is not who she says she is, Calvin. I know that. But she is a good woman, I can feel it." Clara put her glove back on. "Be careful with her." He looked at her steadily. "I am not being anything with her yet, Clara." "No," Clara agreed. "But you are about to be. And she is fragile in ways she would not like you to know about, so just be careful." He nodded and went around to the front of the building. He knocked on the frame of the open front door and heard Doc Henshaw call him in. Doc was making notes at his desk in the front room, and he looked up with a friendly wave. "She is upstairs," Doc said, without Calvin having said a word. Calvin looked at him. Doc smiled and went back to his notes. "Brought you a fresh pot of coffee this morning without being asked. You deserve a fresh pot of coffee, Calvin." He went upstairs. He knocked on the door at the top of the staircase, which was half open anyway. He could see through the gap that the room was small and spare. A narrow bed, a washstand, a chair by the window, and a small table on which the woman had arranged the few things she seemed to own with a precision that somehow made the plainness of the room feel lived, in rather than empty. She opened the door the rest of the way and looked at him without surprise, as she always did. And today she had taken the black jacket off and was wearing just the black dress and had her sleeves rolled to the elbow, and there was a piece of chalk dust on her left forearm that told him she had been practicing her lessons. "You are here again," she said, echoing Clara without knowing it. "I thought I would see if you wanted to take a walk," he said, and then felt immediately that this was the most exposed he had been in years and that he had handled it with approximately zero grace. She looked at him for a moment. "A walk," she repeated. "There is a creek about a quarter-mile east of town," he said, recovering slightly. "The catfish lily is blooming. It only does it for about 10 days in April, and it is something to see." She tilted her head very slightly. "You came to town on a Friday morning to take me to see a flower." "Yes," he said, because there was no earthly point in pretending otherwise. She was quiet for a moment, and he could see her thinking, weighing something, and then she uncrossed her arms and picked up her jacket from the chair. "Give me one moment," she said. The creek was exactly as he had described it, and the catfish lily was blooming in great pale yellow clusters along the bank, and the water was running clear over smooth stones, and everything smelled of wet clay and new green things growing. She stood at the edge of the bank and looked at it all with the most unguarded expression he had seen from her yet, which was not entirely unguarded but was getting there. "You were right," she said. "It is something to see." He sat down on a flat rock near the bank and looked at the water. She stood for another moment and then sat on the rock beside him, not right next to him but close enough that he was aware of every inch of the distance between them. They were quiet for a while. This did not bother either of them, which itself was unusual, and they both felt it. "You have not asked me anything," she said eventually. "You have not told me anything," he said. "I was waiting for those to happen in the same order." She looked at the water. The light was good late morning, warm but not brutal, and it hit the water in a way that made it look like it was made of something more valuable than water. She had her hands in her lap and was looking at them now, turning a small ring on her right hand. He noticed it was on her right hand, not her left, and he noticed it looked like it had been recently moved from the left. "The name I gave is not my name," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him with a flash of genuine surprise, not the controlled near surprise she usually showed, but real, unmanaged surprise, and he liked it. It made her look like herself, whoever that was. "Clara." She guessed. "No, I just know. You say it a beat too slow, like you're remembering to answer to it." She was quiet again, but differently this time. Less guarded, more thoughtful. "What is your name?" he asked. And then, because it was getting close to sundown and he had promised himself he would ask before then, he said it plainly and without any pretense of not caring. "Your real one." The sun was in its last hour above the hills, sending long amber light across the creek bank and gilding everything it touched. She was still looking at the water. He was looking at her profile, at the clean line of her jaw and the careful set of her mouth, and he waited. "Della," she said. "Della Holloway." The name came out of her like a breath she had been holding for a long time, and he could hear the relief in it, the relief of being called what you actually were. "My mother's name was Holloway. I kept it." She paused. "Or rather, I went back to it." "Della," he said, just to say it, just to give it back to her. It suited her in a way that Lucinda Voss never had. She turned and looked at him fully then in the falling amber light, and what she showed him in that moment was the thing underneath all the careful management, something hurt and something brave and something that was working very hard to keep itself intact. He looked back at her with complete steadiness, because he was a steady man, and because what she needed in this moment was not intensity but solidity, someone who would not be rattled by whatever she was about to show him. "My husband," she said, "was not a good man." He said nothing. He waited. "I did not know that when I married him," she said. "I was 22 and I was in a difficult situation, and he seemed safe, established. He had money and standing, and I was a school teacher in a Missouri town who had no family left to go back to." She folded her hands more tightly in her lap. "By the time I understood what he was, we had been married 2 years. And then another year passed, and another. It is not as simple as people think leaving. People say you simply leave, as if it is one action rather than 100. You have to plan. You have to have somewhere to go and something to go with, and you have to not be stopped." Calvin was very still. The creek ran on beside them. "He died 3 months ago," she said. "A riding accident, genuinely an accident, not anything I caused or arranged, though I know there are people in the town we came from who would say otherwise if they knew I had left, because they would not be able to accept that I was simply relieved." Her voice did not break, but it changed in texture slightly, became denser. "I was relieved, Calvin. My husband died and I was relieved. And then I felt sick for being relieved, and then I was relieved again, and it has been going on like that for 3 months." "That sounds right," he said quietly. She blinked and looked at him. "Most people would not say that." "Most people have not had to survive anything," he said simply. "It sounds right to me. You loved the man you thought he was. You feared the man he actually was. When the man he actually was died, both those things are still in you trying to settle." She stared at him. Something in her expression was shifting slowly, like a door that had been stuck for a long time beginning to move. "Yes," she said. "That is, yes, exactly. You took a new name," he said. "You came to a place no one knew you. You wore the mourning clothes because you are genuinely mourning something, just not only what people assume. The mourning clothes also make people less likely to ask questions," she said, and the wry note in her voice was fully wry now, not almost, not barely fully, and it sounded like a woman who used to be funny and was finding her way back to it. He laughed just briefly, and she looked startled, and then she laughed too, and it changed everything about that creek bank in that golden hour. "Della Holloway," he said again, and he meant it to feel like something solid, something hers. "That is a good name." "It was my mother's," she said, softer now. "She died when I was 9, fever, my father," she stopped. "There was not much left after her. I am sorry. A long time ago," she said, but not so long that it did not show in her face. They sat by the creek until the sun finished going down, and the first stars came out over the Texas hills, and they talked about things that were easier: the school, the students, Tommy Birch, who had indeed tested her in the first 5 minutes and found her satisfactory, little Margaret Flores, who had given her a drawing of a horse that looked like a very rectangular dog, and which Della had hung above her washstand. Calvin told her about the double R, about the 10 years of building it, about Pete Aldridge leaving for New Mexico, about the particular stubborn stretch of the north fence line that needed replacing every spring, because the soil under it had a quality that destroyed fence posts within 2 years, and he had never fully figured out why. She listened to him talk about the ranch with an attention that he noticed, really listened, asked questions that showed she had been following what he said, and it had been a long time since he had talked to someone who listened that way. When they walked back to town in the blue dusk, they walked close enough that their arms brushed once, twice, and neither of them moved away. He brought her to Doc Henshaw's door and touched his hat brim and said good night, and she said good night, and just before she went inside she turned back and said, "Thank you, Calvin, for asking." He understood she meant his question about her real name. "I am glad you told me," he said. He rode back to the double R in the dark, and the night was full of cricket song and the smell of sage, and he felt more thoroughly alive than he had in a long time, and it was a feeling that scared him a little, which he decided was appropriate. May came in warm and green, and Calvin found himself in Redrock Flats with a regularity that delighted Clara Henshaw and amused Doc, and made Hattie Greer watch from her store porch with a knowing smile that she did not bother to hide. He had genuine ranch business to conduct, of course. The spring cattle drive preparations required trips to the feed merchant, the land office, the veterinarian. But he timed these errands to overlap with the school's noon break, which gave him an hour of Della's company, which he had discovered was a thing he wanted more of rather than less. She was a remarkable teacher. He heard this from multiple people, from Elena Flores, who reported that Margaret had come home singing a French word for butterfly, and had been doing it for 3 straight days, from the school board's Mr. Porter, who was a difficult man to impress, and who told Calvin with transparent relief that Miss Voss was the best teacher the school had had in its 12-year history. From Tommy Birch's father, who said that Tommy had started reading voluntarily, which the man described as a miracle of the same order as the burning bush. He told Della these things, not as flattery but as information, and she received them the same way, not dismissively, but carefully, the way someone receives something they are not quite sure yet they deserve to keep. In the evenings, when he stayed in town late enough to justify it, they would sit on the bench outside Doc Henshaw's and talk while the main street settled into its nighttime quiet, the lanterns in the saloon throwing orange rectangles across the dirt, the sound of someone's piano playing something slow and sweet. She told him about growing up in Missouri, about the schooling she had received from a teacher who had believed fiercely in her, about the books she had read, and the ones she had not yet read and wanted to. He told her about his own growing up, a cattle family in central Texas, a mother who had died of pneumonia when he was 11, a father who was a hard man but a fair one, a younger sister, Alice, who had married a carpenter in San Antonio, and who wrote him long letters full of news about people he did not know and which he read cover to cover regardless. On a Thursday evening in the third week of May, they were sitting on the bench, and the night was warm enough to not need a jacket, and there were fireflies, which was early for fireflies, but the spring had been warm. Della was watching them with the open expression she was saving more and more for him, and Calvin was watching her watch them, and he thought about Clara's warning. She is fragile in ways she would not like you to know about, and he thought about it seriously, because he took Clara seriously, and he thought about what fragile meant. He did not think Della Holloway was fragile in the way people usually meant when they said it about women, meaning easily broken or in need of protection. She had survived things that would have broken a lesser person, and she had crossed into Texas alone on a stagecoach wearing another woman's name as armor, and she had walked into a school full of strangers and made it her own within a week. She was not easily broken. What she was, he thought, was someone who had learned to hold herself together so well that she had forgotten she was allowed to let other people help. She had built walls not out of weakness but out of necessity, and she had been behind them so long that the idea of coming out was the terrifying part, not anything on the outside. He thought about this, and then he thought, you do not knock those walls down. You stand near them quietly until the person inside decides to open the door. He was still thinking about this when she said, without looking away from the fireflies, I think I would like to stay here, in Redrock Flats. He was very careful not to react in a way that would make her feel watched. It is a good town, he said, small, but the people are decent. Most of them, she said, with a slight note toward Chester Pruitt. Most, he agreed. She was quiet, and then, I have not stayed anywhere long enough in the last several years to put down anything that resembled a root, not since before I was married. She picked at a thread on her sleeve, a rare nervous gesture he had not seen from her before. The school is good. Clara and the doc they feel like family, which is a thing I have not had in a long time and which I had started to believe I was not supposed to have. You are supposed to have it, he said, and he kept his voice steady and quiet, but he felt it land with a weight that was real. She looked at him sideways. You say things plainly, she said. I find it saves time. Where I came from, people said things as indirectly as possible, she said. It was a quality held up as refinement. I spent a long time learning to hear what people actually meant underneath what they were saying. That sounds exhausting. It is, she said, and then more quietly, it is very restful talking to you. He did not say anything to that. He did not need to. The fireflies moved between the fence posts, and the stars above the street were the brilliant, uncomplicated stars of a West Texas sky, and they sat in comfortable quiet for another half hour before she said good night. The first week of June, Calvin brought Della to the Double R. He had asked her carefully, not wanting it to feel like anything other than what it was, a man showing a woman the place he lived because he wanted her to see it. She had accepted in the same spirit, which he appreciated. He picked her up at Doc Henshaw's on a Saturday morning with a buckboard rather than his saddle horse, because she had not mentioned having ridden much and he did not want to assume. She came out in a dress that was still dark but was a deep navy rather than solid black, which was the first time he had seen her in anything other than full mourning, and he noticed it without comment, but it settled warmly somewhere in his chest. The double R was 3 miles north of town, a straight road that turned to a rutted track after the second mile, and then opened out onto a flat bench of land where the ranch house sat looking south toward the hills. The house was nothing elaborate: 2 stories of weathered timber, a wide porch, real glass windows that he had paid considerably for, but it was solid and clean, and it sat on the land like it had been there a long time, which it had. She got down from the buckboard before he could help her and stood looking at the house for a moment, then turning to look at the hills and the wide blue sweep of the Texas sky and the horses in the near pasture. "It is beautiful," she said, and she meant it straight through, no reservation. He showed her around the house, the barn, the chicken coop, the kitchen garden that was doing badly because he was not a natural gardener and kept forgetting to water things, which made her laugh outright. He had coffee ready and they sat on the porch, and she asked him intelligent questions about the cattle operation, the range, the water rights situation with the Prout family that had been simmering for 2 years over a shared creek boundary. "Chester Prout has been claiming that the north fence is 200 yards into his range," Calvin explained. "I had a survey done last year that says it is not, but Chester does not respect surveys he did not pay for. Is it likely to become a real problem?" "Chester talks more than he acts," Calvin said. "I try not to give him a reason to start acting." She thought about this. "And if he does, then I deal with it," he said. She looked at him steadily. "You are a man who deals with things," she said, not as a compliment exactly, more as an observation being confirmed. "I try to be," he said. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something he did not expect. "I was afraid of men who dealt with things, for a long time. My husband was a man who dealt with things. The way he dealt with them," she stopped. "I suppose I am saying I understand now that it matters very much how a person deals with things, not just that they do." He looked at her, and she was looking down at her coffee cup. "I think that is one of the most important distinctions there is," he said. She nodded slowly. He said very quietly, because it needed to be said but not loudly, "Whatever happened, whatever was done to you, that is not something I would ever—" "I know," she said, cutting him off gently but not unkindly, and she looked up and met his eyes. "I know, Calvin. That is why I told you about it." He held her gaze for a moment, and what passed between them was not yet spoken, but was real, fully real, the way some things are true before they are said out loud. She stayed for most of the afternoon, and when he drove her back to town in the early evening, the sky was doing spectacular things in shades of rose and copper and violet. She watched it and he watched her, and the horse plodded along at its own pace, and neither of them was in a hurry. When they reached town, she turned to him on the bench of the buckboard and looked at him for a moment. "I want you to know," she said carefully, "that I am not yet—" She stopped and seemed to be choosing words with unusual difficulty, which was unlike her. "I am still finding my way back to myself," she said finally. "And I am finding that I want to find that with you nearby, but I need you to know that I am still finding it." "I know," he said. "I am not going anywhere." She looked at him for another moment, and then she did something he had not expected. She reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, just briefly, just one press of her fingers against his. And then she climbed down from the buckboard and walked to Doc Henshaw's door. He sat there for a moment before he got the reins again. His heart was doing something entirely unfamiliar, and he thought, carefully and honestly, "I love her." And then, because he was Calvin Rhodes, he thought, well, that makes sense. He did not tell her this yet. It was too early and she was still finding herself, and he could wait. He was a man who knew how to wait for the right time, which was a skill that had served him well with cattle and fences and difficult neighbors, and which he had not expected to serve him here, but which was, it turned out, exactly what was required. June moved into July, and the summer heat descended on Redrock Flats with its full, unforgiving weight, and Calvin and Della found a rhythm. He came to town on Tuesdays and Saturdays. She rode out to the Double R the first Sunday of each month, which started as one visit and became a standing arrangement without either of them quite deciding it. She started helping him with the kitchen garden, which had been failing under his care for 3 years and which bloomed into surprising productivity under hers. She brought a book about kitchen cultivation from the school's small library and read it on the porch while he did evening chores, and she told him what it said, and he did what it said, and by August they had more tomatoes and squash and beans than one man could reasonably eat. The school was out for summer, which meant Della's days in town were less structured, and Calvin sometimes found her helping Clara with her own garden, or helping Hattie sort new stock at the store, or at the small desk in her room upstairs reading and writing in a journal that she kept without apparent self-consciousness. He asked her about the journal once, and she said she had kept journals since she was 15. She had destroyed 3 of them when she was married because she had not been able to bear what was in them, and she had started this one the week after her husband died. "What is in this one?" he asked. "The beginning of afterward," she said simply. One evening in July, sitting on the bench outside Doc Henshaw's, she asked him about the engagement he had mentioned once in passing. "Sarah Coulter," he said. "We met when I first came out here. She was visiting her brother who had a claim on the East Range. She was 20 and I was 20, and we just fell into it the way young people do when they are in the same place at the same time, and neither of them has a reason not to." He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She was a good woman. I do not say that as a qualification, I mean it plainly. She was good and she was not suited to this life and she knew it before I did. Leaving was the right thing for her." "Did it take long getting over it?" "About a year," he said. "Then I went back to work. The ranch was still small then and there was so much to do that grief did not have much room to move around in." He paused. "It was probably not healthy." "No," she agreed. "But I got the south pasture fenced," he said with a straight face. She made a sound that was nearly a laugh. "That is one way to process things." "It is the way I knew how then," he said. "I like to think I have grown more sophisticated since." "You have," she said, and there was such genuine warmth in it that he looked at her and she looked at him, and something had shifted subtly, like a compass needle that had been wavering finally settling. In August, Chester Pruitt's water dispute became less theoretical. Calvin arrived at the Double R one evening to find that a section of his north fence had been cut, and 2 of Pruitt's men had pushed a small herd of Pruitt cattle onto Calvin's range. He rode out to assess the damage, alone and in the early morning, and found the cattle on his land and the fence neatly cut in a way that was absolutely intentional. He did not react with anger. He rode to Pruitt's place and knocked on the door, and when Chester came out, still red-faced, and this time not yet drunk, Calvin spoke to him quietly and clearly about property law and the survey results and the legal liability Chester was incurring by this kind of action. Chester blustered and threatened, and Calvin listened to all of it with steady patience and then said, equally steadily, that if the cattle were not off his range and the fence repaired by noon the following day, he would be riding to the county seat to see the land commissioner, and he had the survey, and Chester did not. Chester raged and Calvin let him rage and then rode home. By the next morning at 9 o'clock, Chester's men were on his range retrieving the cattle and repairing the fence, and Chester himself did not emerge from his house. Calvin told Della about it that Tuesday, and she listened carefully and then said, "You handled that without anyone getting hurt." "That was the goal." "Not everyone in this part of the country would see that as the goal," she said. "I know," he said, "but it is easier to sleep at night." She looked at him with that full, open expression that she was saving less and less only for fireflies and sunsets, and was showing him now in full daylight in the middle of conversations without needing the cover of something beautiful to justify it. "Calvin," she said. "Yes." She seemed to be deciding something. He waited the way he always waited, with the easy patience that was both his nature and, for her, a gift. "I think I am finding myself again," she said. "Or rather, I think I found her. I am not sure she is exactly who she was before. She is older and she has seen more and she is somewhat more suspicious of kind weather. She paused. But she is here. I can feel her. He looked at her very directly. She always was, he said. You just had to come a long way to pick her up. She pressed her lips together and her eyes were bright, and she said with a voice that was steady but only just, I think I am in love with you. He was quiet for one moment, not from surprise, not from hesitation, but from the overwhelming, grateful, grounding weight of it landing, and he said, I know I am in love with you. I have known it since April. She gave a short, real, unmanaged laugh. April, she repeated. You have been sitting on that since April. I told you I was not going anywhere, he said. She stood up from the bench and he stood up too, and she put her hands on either side of his face, which she had to reach up slightly to do, and she looked at him for a long moment, really looked at him, the way she had been looking at the catfish lily and the fireflies, but more so, with her whole self. And then she kissed him, and he put his arms around her and held her carefully and completely at the same time. The bench outside Doc Henshaw's office on a Tuesday evening in late August in the year 1878 was not a particularly grand setting for the beginning of the rest of things. But Della Holloway had had enough of grand settings. She had had rooms with velvet curtains and mahogany furniture, and the kind of grand that hollows you out from the inside. And what she had here, the warm, dark air of a Texas evening, the distant piano from the dusty boot, the sound of someone's dog barking lazily 3 streets over, and a man who had waited since April was enough. It was more than enough. It was the first thing in a long time that had felt entirely real and entirely hers. Clara Henshaw appeared in her doorway approximately 4 seconds later, which meant she had been waiting. She looked at them with an expression of profound and unashamed satisfaction. Well, she said, finally. Della pulled back slightly from Calvin and laughed, and Calvin looked at Clara over Della's head and said, with total dignity, Were you watching from the window? Obviously, Clara said. I'm going to make celebratory cornbread, don't go anywhere. And she disappeared back inside. Della shook her head. She is wonderful. She is a menace, Calvin said with affection. She is the most wonderful menace in West Texas. September brought the beginning of the new school term, and with it, a decision that Della had been arriving at over the course of the summer without quite letting herself acknowledge it. The room above Doc Henshaw's office had been a necessary first step, a place to be that was safe and temporary while she found her footing. She had found her footing. She had found more than that. But she was also aware, with the careful awareness that characterized everything she did, of how things looked and how she wanted things to be. She was a schoolteacher in a town that respected her. She had a name here, her real name, given back to her by a man who had asked before sundown, and she intended to keep it good. Calvin was aware of the same things, and he was also aware that what he wanted, very clearly, without uncertainty, was Della Holloway to be permanent in his life, which in 1878 in West Texas meant one particular thing. He did not ask her impulsively. He thought about it the way he thought about everything important, which is to say thoroughly and from multiple angles. And then on a Sunday morning in late September, when they were sitting on the porch of the Double R with coffee and the last of the garden's tomatoes, which Della had made into a preserve that was sitting in jars on the kitchen shelf like small jewels, he said, I want to ask you something serious. She looked at him. She was wearing a blue-gray dress today, the morning clothes set aside weeks ago without ceremony, which had felt like the right way to do it. She looked in this morning light like herself, Della Holloway, 26 years old with dark eyes and a straight spine and a mouth that was learning to smile more freely, and which Calvin thought was, objectively, the finest thing he had ever seen. Ask, she said. I am going to ask you to marry me, he said, and I want you to know that I am asking because I love you and because I want to spend my life with you and for no other reason. Not for propriety or convenience or because it is the practical thing. For you, he paused. I also want you to know that if the answer is not yes, I would rather you tell me plainly, because I would rather have your honest no than a yes that was not fully yours. She was looking at him with very bright eyes. "You are still asking plainly," she said. "I told you it saves time." She took his hand and held it in both of hers, the way she had that first time on the buckboard seat, and she looked at it rather than at him for a moment, and then she said, "Yes, Calvin, it is fully mine. Yes." He lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her fingers, and she made a small, quiet sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob, but was the particular sound of something that has been held very tightly finally releasing, and he held her hand against his lips until she had finished feeling whatever she was feeling. Then she looked up and she was smiling, fully, openly, with no management of it at all, and he thought, there she is. They were married in November, in the small white church on the edge of Redrock Flats, on a cold, clear morning when the sky was the particular bright blue that only West Texas manages in autumn, hard and perfect, and absolutely without apology. Hattie Greer wore her best dress and cried visibly from the second pew. Doc Henshaw was Calvin's witness. Clara was Della's, and she had spent 3 days helping Della alter a dress, not a wedding white dress, because Della said that felt wrong for the woman she was now, but a dress in a deep cream color, almost gold, that Clara had owned once for a special occasion, and which she pressed on Della with such fierce generosity that Della had no choice but to accept. Tommy Birch had polished his shoes for the occasion, which according to his father had never happened before. Little Margaret Flores gave Della a drawing of a woman in a yellow dress standing next to a tall man with a very round hat, which she presented with the gravity of a person bestowing something precious, because she was. Elena Flores brought tamales to the reception, which was held in the Henshaw parlor because it was warmest, and because Clara had been planning it since August and nobody was going to tell her otherwise. Even Mr. Porter from the school board came, looking uncomfortable in his good clothes but pleased, and told Della that the school had a permanent position for her as long as she wanted it, which she said she very much did. Chester Prout did not attend and nobody missed him. The ceremony itself was short, because the minister, Pastor Webb, was a man of economy where words were concerned, and because both Calvin and Della had asked him to keep it simple. What was said was meant. What was promised was meant. When Calvin took Della's hands in his, he looked at her with the same steady brown eyes that had held her gaze without flinching since April, and what he felt was not the nervousness of ceremony but the deep, grounded rightness of something being exactly what it was supposed to be. She looked back at him and felt, for the first time in years, that she was standing on solid ground. They walked out of the church into the cold, bright morning to the sound of Hattie Greer beginning to applaud before they were even fully through the door, and everyone else following, and the sky was that impossible blue, and Della Holloway, Della Rhodes as of that moment. Though she kept the Holloway as a middle name because it was her mother's, and she was done with letting things that belonged to her be taken, was 26 years old and standing in the November light in a cream gold dress next to a man who had asked her real name before sundown, and she was, genuinely and completely, happy. That winter was a good one. The double R was warm and weather-tight, the cattle came through the cold well, and the kitchen had Della's preserves on the shelf and a book open on the table at most hours of the day. Calvin fixed the north fence line properly in December with a new post material he had read about that was more resistant to the soil, and Della tutored a student through Christmas who was struggling with arithmetic, and they spent the evenings reading to each other by the fire, which was something Calvin had never done with another person, and which he found was one of his favorite things in the world. She read him French poetry once, translating as she went, and he lay on the rug with his head propped on his hand and listened and told her it was the finest thing he had heard in his life, which she told him was clearly an exaggeration. "It is not," he said. "You are biased." "Obviously," he said, echoing Clara. "That does not make me wrong." She threw the book at him gently, and he caught it and read the page she had been on and said, with complete sincerity, that he actually did think it was remarkable. She looked at him and shook her head and he grinned, which was a thing he had done more in the last 7 months than in the previous 5 years, and she thought, this is what it is supposed to feel like. In the spring of 1879, two things happened that shook Redrock Flats. The first was that Chester Prout, who had apparently not entirely given up on his water dispute regardless of Calvin's legal argument, hired a surveyor of his own who produced results that differed significantly from the previous survey. This produced a genuine legal complication that required Calvin to ride to the county seat at Marfa and spend 3 days with the land commissioner's office going over both surveys in detail. He did not want to leave Della for 3 days, which was a new feeling, and one he was trying not to be foolish about. "You lived without me for 26 years, he told himself, and then told her this when he was packing his saddlebag. "Almost 27, she said, from the doorway of the bedroom with her arms crossed. "And I will be fine. I have students to teach and a garden to start, and Clara will adopt me completely in your absence. That is what I am afraid of," he said. "She has excellent taste and fascinating opinions," Della said. "I could do worse." He kissed her in the doorway with more thoroughness than was strictly necessary before a 3-day trip and rode to Marfa. He came back with a clear legal ruling in his favor, because the previous survey had been filed with the county 2 years earlier and was the official record, and Chester Prout's new survey had significant methodological problems that the land commissioner pointed out in writing. Chester accepted this with bad grace, and Calvin sent him a copy of the ruling by messenger rather than delivering it personally, because there was no point in standing in front of a man's wounded pride. The second thing that happened was more significant. It was an afternoon in early May, and Della was finishing her school day when Hattie Greer came to the schoolhouse door with an expression that Della had not seen on her face before, not alarmed exactly, but grave in a way that put Della immediately on alert. "There is a man in town," Hattie said quietly. "Arrived on the noon stage. He is asking around about a woman, says his name is Franklin Voss, says he is looking for his brother's widow." Della's face went very still. Franklin Voss was her dead husband's brother, and he was not the kind of man who traveled hundreds of miles to offer condolences. She dismissed the students calmly and walked with Hattie back to the general store, and she told Hattie, quickly and plainly, enough of the truth for Hattie to understand the situation. She had left Missouri using a false name. Franklin Voss was a man like his brother, established, connected, and the sort of person who did not like loose ends. Her husband's estate had been considerable, and there were questions about certain property that she had, technically, as the widow, some legal claim to, which she had never intended to pursue but which Franklin might not believe. "He wants to bring you back," Hattie said. "He wants to manage the situation," Della said. "Which in his understanding means bringing me back." Hattie sat down heavily behind her counter. "Does Calvin know any of this? He knows about my marriage. He does not know about the estate or Franklin. He needs to know now," Hattie said firmly, in the voice of a woman who has seen enough situations deteriorate from lack of timely information. Della was already reaching for the paper to send a message to the double R. Calvin arrived before sundown. He did not arrive alarmed or reactive. He arrived the way he always arrived at difficult situations, steady, clear-eyed, listening first. He sat with Della in the back room of Hattie's store, and she told him everything, the full picture, the estate, Franklin's likely purpose, the property dispute that she had never pursued because she had only wanted out, not anything that belonged to that life. He listened to all of it without changing his expression, which she had learned to read well enough now to know was not indifference but attention. When she finished, he said, "Do you want to pursue the estate claim?" She blinked. "No, I never know." "Then we deal with Franklin the same way I dealt with Chester Prout," he said. "Plainly, legally, and with documentation." He paused. "You are legally Mrs. Della Rhodes as of November last year. You are a school teacher with a permanent position and a residence in this county. Any claim he has on you as the widow of his brother is governed by Texas law, not Missouri law, and Texas law in this matter is quite clear." She stared at him. You know Texas property and estate law. I have been reading, he said, slightly deadpan. You have been a good influence on my study habits. She made a sound between a laugh and something harder to name. He cannot compel you to go anywhere, Calvin said. Not legally, not otherwise. Not while I am standing. He said this last part not as a threat or as something dramatic, but as a simple fact. I would like to speak with him. Calvin, not as a confrontation, he said, as a clear statement of the situation. He came here not knowing you had married. That changes the legal and practical picture entirely. He may not know what he is actually dealing with. She looked at him for a long moment. You do not need to. I know I do not need to, he said. I want to. Franklin Voss was at the Dusty Boot, which was where strangers with something on their minds almost always ended up in Redrock Flats. He was a man of about 45, with his brother's dark coloring but not his brother's physical scale, dressed too well for the heat in a jacket that had not been made in Texas. He had a sharp face and the eyes of a man who had spent most of his life calculating. Calvin sat down across from him at the corner table without invitation. Franklin looked at him with the expression of a man who was accustomed to other people being at a disadvantage. I don't believe we've met. Calvin Rhodes, Calvin said. I own the Double R on the North Range, and I am the husband of Della Rhodes, who I believe you came here looking for. A long pause. Something moved through Franklin Voss's calculated expression. She remarried. In November, Calvin said. She is a resident of Presidio County, Texas. She is employed as a teacher in the Redrock Flats school. She has a legal domicile and a legal name in the state. He paused. Whatever your purpose in coming here, I want you to understand the situation as it actually is. Franklin looked at him carefully. Whatever he had expected, it was not this. The estate. She has no interest in pursuing any claim on the estate, Calvin said. She has said so, and I can provide you with a written statement to that effect, witnessed and notarized if you need it to close out whatever legal matters are pending in Missouri. He kept his voice level and his eyes steady. She wants nothing from that life. Nothing. She wants to be left to build the one she has. Another long silence. Franklin Voss had the look of a man recalculating. He had expected a runaway widow, possibly frightened, possibly alone, certainly manageable. He had found a married woman with a calm husband who knew the law and was prepared to use it. She was using a false name, Franklin said, but there was less force in it now. She was a woman who needed to find safety, Calvin said quietly. That speaks to the circumstances of her first marriage, not to any crime on her part. Franklin looked away briefly, and Calvin thought he saw something shift in the man. Not entirely comfortable with himself, maybe, not entirely at peace with what his brother had been. It was a small crack, but it was there. If she truly wants nothing from the estate, Franklin said slowly, then there is no legal business remaining. That is my understanding as well, Calvin said. A written statement signed by Della would confirm that for the Missouri court and close the matter. Franklin was quiet for a long time. He turned his glass on the table. He started and then stopped. Thomas was difficult, he said finally, and it cost him something to say it, not much but something. I knew that. Calvin said nothing. I will take the statement back to Missouri, Franklin said, if you can have it prepared. By tomorrow morning, Calvin said. Franklin nodded once sharply and picked up his glass, and Calvin rose from the table, and that was the end of it. Not with fire or fury or a gun on the table, with clarity and a notarized statement and a man who did not want to fight a battle he could not win. Della signed the statement at Doc Henshaw's desk by lamplight, with Clara hovering protectively in the doorway and Doc serving as notary. Her hand was entirely steady. When it was done, she sat back and let out a breath that seemed to come from somewhere deep and structural, and Calvin, sitting beside her, put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and he felt her shoulders drop for the first time since Hattie had come to the schoolhouse. Franklin Voss left on the morning stage and did not look back, and nobody in Redrock Flats particularly regretted his departure. Clara, standing on the porch with her coffee and watching the stage go, said, Good riddance to things that should have stayed in Missouri. Hattie, next to her, said, Amen. That summer stretched out long and warm and good. The Double R's cattle operation had its best year since Calvin had started it, and he took on a new hand, a young man named Orrin Bright, 19 years old, from a family in the next county, who was quiet and willing, and who learned everything he was taught without needing to be told twice. Calvin found he liked having someone to share the work again, and Orrin was respectful of the house and of Della, which was the most important qualification as far as Calvin was concerned. Della's kitchen garden was spectacular by July, rows of tomatoes and beans and squash, and two kinds of pepper that she had gotten seeds for from Elena Flores, who had gotten them from her mother in the territory to the south. She and Elena had become genuine friends, which pleased everyone around them, and on Thursday evenings Elena sometimes came for supper with her daughter Margaret, and Margaret sat under the kitchen table with the ranch dog, a brown hound named Jericho who had appeared at the Double R door 2 winters ago and never left, and drew pictures while the adults talked. In August, Della realized she was expecting a child. She told Calvin on a Sunday morning, sitting on the porch with their coffee, the same way they had sat when he had asked her to marry him, and he was very still for a moment in the way he was still when he was thinking something important, and then he turned to look at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before, not quite anything she had words for, something that was beyond happiness and deeper than it. More like a man seeing something he had not known to hope for and finding it already there. Della, he said. Yes, she said. He put his hand on the side of her face very gently, and she leaned into it the way Jericho leaned into a scratch behind the ears, with total unself-conscious trust, which was a thing she had not known she was capable of 9 months ago and which moved him every time she did it. When, he asked, February, I think. Clara will know better. Clara is going to be insufferably pleased, Della said, and insufferably wonderful about it, he added. They sat with it for a while in the good morning air, and Della thought about February, about a child, about a thing that was hers and Calvin's and the future's, and she felt with great clarity and no ambivalence that this was right, that she was ready, that the woman she had been finding her way back to all this past year was fully home and fully present and ready to be a mother, which the girl who had grown up in Missouri without enough of one had wanted for a long time without ever being able to say it out loud. I am ready for this, she said, half to herself. I know you are, he said, completely to her. Clara was indeed insufferably wonderful about it. She announced she was going to knit everything the baby could possibly need, and she began immediately, her needles clicking in the evenings with a focused ferocity that was inspiring to watch. Doc Henshaw, who had delivered most of the babies in Redrock Flats for 20 years, said he would be honored, which was the plainest and most genuine thing he ever said, and Della kissed him on the cheek, which made him turn very red. Hattie set aside a bolt of good flannel fabric. Elena Flores brought more food. Orrin Bright, when told, said, That's real good, Mr. Rhodes, with a sincerity that was entirely unperformed. Tommy Birch, who was now 14, and in his last year under Della's teaching before he would go to work on his family's land, took the news philosophically and said he hoped the baby would like to read. The fall was busy and good. The school year began, and Della taught with the steady energy that had always characterized her work, and she did so through October and well into November, when she finally accepted that standing at the chalkboard for 6 hours was becoming more of an effort than it had been. She spoke with Mr. Porter, who was by now so devoted to her continued presence in Redrock Flats that he would have agreed to anything, and they arranged for a temporary arrangement through the winter months, with Hattie's niece, a sensible girl of 20 named Ruth who had schooling, taking the class until Della was ready to return. February arrived cold and clear, with ice on the Double R's water trough that Orrin broke every morning, and the stars at night were so bright and so close over the flat Texas land that they seemed like something you could reach up and rearrange. On a Thursday morning in the second week of February 1880, Della Rhodes gave birth to a boy. He was born in the bedroom of the Double R Ranch house with Clara as midwife and Doc standing by and Calvin in the parlor, below doing something he would never fully be able to account for later, pacing, probably, or possibly standing very still, which for him meant the same thing. When Doc came down to the parlor door and said, "You have a son, Calvin, and Della as well," Calvin put one hand against the door frame and breathed for a moment before he went up. Della was in the bed with the baby in her arms, and she was exhausted and perfect, and when she looked up and saw Calvin come through the door, her face did the thing it had started doing since that evening on the bench the previous August. It opened entirely, no management, no careful calculation, just love, plain and present and unafraid. The baby was small and red and categorically unimpressed with the world, which Calvin thought showed excellent judgment. He sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his wife holding his son and felt something so large and so simple that he did not have a word for it and suspected no word existed. He put his arm around Della and she leaned into him, and the baby made a sound of absolute indifference to the weight of the moment. "What do we call him?" Calvin said. Della looked down at the baby. "I have been thinking about it for months," she said. "I want to call him Thomas." Calvin looked at her. Thomas was her first husband's name, and he started to ask, and she said, "Not for him. Thomas was my grandfather's name. My mother's father, who she loved very much and who I never met but whose name she always said with," she stopped and smiled slightly, "with exactly the tenderness I feel about this boy." "Thomas Rhodes," Calvin said. "Thomas Holloway Rhodes," she said. "If that is all right." "It is all right," he said. It was better than all right. It carried everything, her mother, her history, her name, their future, all in 3 words. Clara, in the doorway, was crying silently, and without any apparent intention to stop. The spring that came after was the kind that makes you understand why people have always felt that seasons are a form of grace. The Double R was in full swing. The cattle drive preparation, the garden, the fence repairs. Orrin Bright singing to himself in the barn at a volume that carried to the house when the wind was right, which Della found irrationally cheering. Thomas Rhodes grew with the spring, fattening and brightening, and developed opinions about everything, about the light and the temperature, and the company and the particular quality of Jericho the hound, who had decided Thomas was his responsibility, and stationed himself below the cradle with the intensity of a man who had been given an important assignment. Della went back to the school in April, and the town of Redrock Flats received her return with a warmth that still, even now, occasionally surprised her. She had been here 2 years. She had arrived wearing mourning clothes and a name nobody knew, and she had built something here, a name, a life, a family, a community that was entirely real and entirely hers. She thought about this on a Friday afternoon in April, walking home from the school through the main street, Thomas wrapped against her in a piece of cloth that Alina had shown her how to use in the manner of the women of her own family, and the afternoon light was doing its West Texas gold thing across the storefronts and the dust, and Hattie waved from her porch, and Doc Henshaw raised his hat in passing, and the school bell was ringing because Ruth had already closed up. And somewhere down the street she could hear the sound of Calvin's horse, because she knew the sound of his horse the way she knew the sound of his voice, completely, from the inside out. She stopped in the street and turned, and he was coming toward her on Buck, the roan gelding, and he saw her and lifted a hand, and she thought about the first time she had seen this street, stepping off the stage in black from collar to hem, carrying a name that was not hers and a grief that was, and this man had crossed over to her that day and said his name and apologized for someone else's behavior and walked her to a safe door. And then he had asked her real name, before sundown. As if her real name was something that mattered to him before he knew anything else. She had never forgotten that. She did not expect to. He rode up and swung down from Buck with the unhurried ease of a man who has done it 10,000 times, and looked at her with brown eyes that were exactly the color of creek water in autumn and asked, "Good day." "Very good," she said. "Tommy Birch read a passage out loud today and he did it perfectly. He did not know I could hear how good it was from the pride he was trying to hide." Calvin smiled. "He is going to be remarkable." "He already is," she said. He looked down at Thomas, who was asleep against her chest with the total trust of a being who had not yet learned that the world required anything from him beyond this. He put one finger very gently under the baby's curled hand, and the baby's fingers opened and closed around it in sleep. "Come home," he said. She looked at him and she thought, this is it. Not the high drama or the grand gesture or the kind of love that makes you less yourself, the kind that makes you more, the kind that knows your name, your real one. "Yes," she said. "Let's go home." They walked down the main street of Redrock Flats in the gold afternoon light, Calvin leading Buck and Della beside him with Thomas between them. And the April day was warm, and the sky was the impossible blue, and the catfish lily was blooming again along the creek east of town, as it did every year for 10 days in April, and it was something to see. The years that followed were good years, full and warm and grounded. The Double R grew, a second barn in the summer of 1881, another 100 head of cattle by fall, a proper dining room addition to the house in 1882 that Calvin and Orrin built together over 3 months while Della directed, and Thomas, now too, and deeply invested in everything happening around him, handed people tools with tremendous seriousness. Orrin Bright, who had grown from a quiet 19-year-old into a capable young man, eventually bought a small claim of his own north of the Double R, and Calvin helped him negotiate the purchase, and they remained good neighbors. Chester Prout gave no more trouble after the land commissioner's ruling. He grew older and somewhat quieter. His nephew Wally eventually left for Arizona on account of a warrant that no one discussed openly, and the water dispute became the kind of old, dead thing that people in small towns referenced as historical rather than current. Thomas Holloway Rhodes turned out to be a child of prodigious energy and curiosity, with his mother's dark eyes and his father's steadiness, and a laugh that came out of him like water running over rocks, constant and clear. He filled the house and the ranch and the school, where he eventually became Della's student and where he was, as Tommy Birch had hoped, devoted to reading. He liked horses with his father's serious appreciation, and he liked books with his mother's complete commitment. And when he was 5, he told Calvin that he intended to be a rancher who was also a poet, and Calvin said that sounded like a fine plan and meant it. In the spring of 1883, Thomas was given a brother. They named him James, after Calvin's father, and Thomas received this with the equanimity of a child who had grown up feeling entirely secure, interested, not threatened, already making plans about teaching James to ride. James was born rounder and louder than Thomas had been, with an opinion about everything from the first hour, and grew into a boy of tremendous sociability who knew everyone in Redrock Flats by name before he could read. Clara Henshaw became, in every practical and emotional sense, their grandmother. She was there for both births. She was there for first steps and first words and first days of school. And she read to both boys in the evenings when she visited with the same undiminished delight in books that had first revealed itself when Della translated French poetry at the kitchen table. Doc Henshaw, who had a heart that was as large as his wife's, taught Thomas and James to play checkers with competitive ferocity and then let them win badly, which they did not realize for years. Della kept teaching for as long as the school board would have her, which turned out to be a very long time. She taught 2 generations of Redrock Flats children reading and writing, and arithmetic and occasionally French, which she offered as an elective on Friday afternoons, and which was more popular than anyone had predicted. She became, over the years, the kind of person a town builds itself around without quite knowing it, The one who has been there long enough to be both history and presence, who remembers the students who grew up and came back, and who welcomes the new ones without comparison. Tommy Birch, who left the school at 14 and went to work his family's land as expected, came back to Della at 22 with a question about whether it was too late for a man who had to work to get any more schooling, and she told him plainly that it was not, and helped him arrange it through a correspondence program. And he went on to study at a school in San Antonio and eventually became a teacher himself, which he told Della in a letter that he would not have done if she had not made him believe in the first week that she took him seriously. She kept that letter in the drawer of her desk in the school. Margaret Flores grew up and got married and brought her own children to Della's school, and the drawings of rectangular horses gave way to actual paintings that Margaret displayed at the county fair every year, and she won twice, which Della attended and applauded with the enthusiasm of a woman who had been there since the very first drawing on the first day. Elena Flores became, as Della had hoped, a lifelong friend, the kind you can sit in silence with, which is the best kind. They cooked together and gardened together and talked on Elena's porch on summer evenings while the children ran through the yard, and when Elena's husband fell ill in 1884, Della was the first person at her door, and she stayed. The injustice of that time and place was something Della felt and named. She saw how Elena and her family were treated at the land office, how the men there spoke differently when a Mexican family came to register a claim than when an Anglo one did, and she said so plainly to Calvin, and then wrote about it in letters to anyone who might hear it. Calvin, who had seen the same things and said less about them, listened to Della and said more, and used his standing in the county to push back where he could, which was not always and not as much as was needed, but it was what was in his power, and he used it. The world moved slowly and was often unjust, and the small acts of fairness and witness inside that slow, unjust world were not nothing. Della had learned this early and held to it, and Calvin, who had grown up in a version of this land that accepted things as they were more easily than she did, found that her refusal to accept them changed how he saw things, which was one of the many ways she made him more than he had been before her. In November of 1888, on their 10th anniversary, Calvin and Della rowed out to the creek east of town. It was too late in the year for the catfish lily, of course. Those bloomed only in April, for 10 days, reliably and briefly. But the creek was still beautiful in November, running clear over the same smooth stones, and the cottonwood trees along the bank had gone gold and were dropping their leaves into the water, which moved them downstream in slow, spinning patterns. They sat on the same flat rock they had sat on that April afternoon 10 years before, when she had told him her real name, and the light was different now, softer, more amber, as autumn light always is. But the creek was the same, and the rock was the same, and the two of them were the same and very different at once, in the way people who have built a life together are, recognizable all the way through, shaped by time and by each other, but not diminished by it. Thomas and James were at the Double R with Orrin Bright, who had become their unofficial uncle and who had a gift for managing their collective energy that Calvin admired deeply. 10 years, Della said. 10 years, Calvin agreed. She looked at the water. She was 36 years old, and the life she had built sat inside her like something solid and warm, like the Double R on its flat bench of land, settled into the ground, real and weather-tight. She had come here in mourning clothes and a borrowed name, on the noon stage in April, carrying a grief that was complicated and a hope that was very small, and she had found a home. Not because the world had been kind to her. It had not always, not early, but because she had been brave enough to step off that stage, and because the right man had crossed the street. "What are you thinking?" Calvin asked. "I am thinking about April of 1878, she said. "About stepping off the stage and seeing this town for the first time and thinking, well, this will do for now." He looked at her sidelong. "Just for now. I did not know you yet," she said. "Reasonable," he allowed. And then you crossed the street, she said, and you did not ask me anything I was not ready to answer, and you walked me to a safe door, and then you came back the next day and the day after that, and you asked me to see a flower. To be fair, it was a remarkable flower. It was, she agreed, and you asked me my real name. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the water. I needed to know it, he said simply. She turned to look at him, and he turned to look at her, and his face was the face of a man she knew completely. The brown eyes and the sun-marked skin, and the expression that was more at rest than she had ever seen it, because the same was true for him, that the life they had built sat in him like something settled, something permanent. She took his hand and held it, and he held hers back, and they sat by the creek in the November light with the cottonwood leaves moving downstream, and there was nothing unresolved between them, nothing frayed, nothing incomplete. "Della," he said, just to say it, just as he had said it that first time. "Yes," she said. And everything about the way she said it meant I am here, and I am whole, and I am yours, and this is my name, and I am not going anywhere. The creek ran on. The leaves turned in the water. The sky above the Texas hills was that late afternoon blue going to gold, the same sky that had been overhead when she arrived, when she walked into the school with her chalk and her slate, when she sat on a bench in the August night and said, "I think I am in love with you," when she stood in a cream gold dress in the November light and meant every word of the promise she made. The same sky over 10 years of a life built on solid ground, with honest hands, and a name asked plainly before sundown. Redrock Flats was a small town in West Texas, and it did not make history in any way that anyone recorded in official papers. The land office in Marfa had no special notation for it. The county records noted births and land claims and cattle drives. The school log recorded enrollment by year. But in the years that followed, when the children of Redrock Flats grew up and told their children about the town they had come from, they mentioned a woman who had arrived on the noon stage in April 1878 wearing mourning clothes and a name nobody recognized, who had become their teacher and built a school worth having and stayed, and a man who had asked her real name before the sun went down. And how those two had built the kind of life on the North Range that people pointed to when they needed to explain what a good life could look like. Not free of difficulty. Not free of the world's injustices or the ordinary hard work of a place and a time that required more of people than was always fair, but real, full, chosen every day. That was what Della Holloway had come looking for when she stepped off the stage. That was what she had found. That was what she kept.